One of the requirements for a country to be de jure a country is international recognition.
You briefly touched on this, but can you go a little bit deeper into the message that China is sending by doing this so close to the election results?
The message is, I can not only take your diplomatic allies, but I can do it whenever I'd like and whatever I please. Taiwan can engage in way more public diplomacy where China has limitations. And by doing so, Taiwan could present itself to the world in a different image and a stronger image.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. Taiwanese products power everything from mobile phones and fridges to guided missiles. Taiwan makes more than 60% of the world's semiconductors. It is a beacon of democracy in the region, but also at the center of the competition for influence between China and the United States in the Indo-Pacific. Yet, for such an important place, just a handful of countries recognize it diplomatically. In fact, on January 15, the number of Taiwan's official diplomatic allies dropped to 11 United Nations members and the Holy See. That came after the Pacific island of Nauru switched recognition to Beijing. Taipei now has only 3 diplomatic allies left in Oceania, 7 countries in the Americas, 1 in Europe, and a tiny monarchy on the African continent. And to find out what's at stake for Taiwan and its diplomatic tug-of-war with Beijing, we're joined by Yavor Kostadinov, an assistant professor at Ming Chuan University. He's speaking to us from the town of Sandanski in Bulgaria. Yavor, thank you very much for being on the program. I want to start with this question. Nauru is an island with a population of around 12,000. It relies heavily on foreign aid. What has Taiwan really lost by losing it as a diplomatic ally?
One of the requirements for a country to be de jure a country is international recognition. So by peeling off the allies of Taiwan and using strategically the timing to do so, PRC is demonstrating that it could suffocate Taiwan's international visibility and also participation. So although the country of Nauru might be very small and insignificant in a way in terms of its clout in international relations, it still has a strong message in the fact that it switched right after the elections in Taiwan.
Right, and I definitely want to talk about that a little bit more. But before we go into that, bigger picture look. Can you explain the quandary countries have with choosing between Beijing and Taipei, and why do they have to choose between those two countries?
Well, some of the countries might use opportunistic behavior and to try to play both countries against each other. This is often the case that I observe that some of the little countries flip-flop quite often. For example, the case of Nauru, I don't believe that this is the first case that they are actually changing side. I believe it's the second time. So this gives agency to these little countries to engage in this kind of behavior. Also, the fact that leaders and bigger allies of Taiwan engage in this kind of behavior, like the United States, their policy has been a policy of ambiguity over the years, which is also a policy of opportunism. And this also sets an example so that the little countries do follow without much consequences towards their behavior. I think that this should stop and that Taiwan should find a way to talk to Beijing and try to mitigate the cost of this kind of opportunistic behavior. Yes.
Yan Chen, a professor of international affairs at National Zhengji University, explains why the Democratic Progressive Party's recent win in Taiwan's presidential election was a trigger for Nauru to switch recognition.
A country like Nauru, so small in the Pacific island, probably can be explained away, but this will not be able to explain away the fact that we have lost 10 diplomatic allies since Tsai Ing-wen took office, and since Lai Ching-te already pledged to continue to toe the line of Tsai Ing-wen, I don't think there will be any dialogue or interaction with Beijing, but also we will continue to lose diplomatic ally. But I didn't expect it comes so fast. in just a few hours later, you learn about Nauru. But this, I think, is what China has worked on before the election, but just waiting for the result of the election so it can, use that to maybe making a statement about, the reaction of Beijing is a continuation of poaching Taiwan's diplomatic ally since we have elected a DPP government.
You briefly touched on this, but can you go a little bit deeper into the message that China is sending by doing this so close to the election results?
Yes, I think the timing is actually crucial here. The message is, I can not only take your diplomatic allies, but I can do it whenever I'd like and whatever I please. So I think this is the underlying message here. And the significance for that is that to punish the voters in Taiwan, basically, for their choice to continue on the same path. And I think in long-term implications for that could be that the diplomatic space for Taiwan then shrinks, and then the PRC could, after that, use the lack of diplomatic support for Taiwan to then, for instance, ban Taiwanese travelers of entering other countries. We have that already somewhere in the world, in some of the countries where Taiwanese are not allowed to enter due to PRC's interference. So this could become more rampant in the future if Taiwan has less and less support, diplomatic support. So, yes.
As we heard that the professor talks about losing more allies as this administration continues, the DPP continues further, with its policies. Do you see that happening?
Well, I think that this kind of external influence on Taiwan's domestic elections should be prevented at all costs. I think Taiwan is doing quite a good job to counter PRC's attempts to destabilize the democratic system and also the governance in Taiwan. And I have to say, it has not been only PRC that have been trying to do that. But the point is that Taiwan is an independent state. It has all the means to govern, and the government in its full capacity to do so. And external interferences, no matter from which side, should be actually blocked and not tolerated. And one example is that Taiwan has been at the forefront of countering disinformation coming from PRC, and I have to say successfully so far. So this could also serve as an example towards other countries that might be facing this kind of interference.
Right. Before we move on, I want to give some context into Taiwan's diplomatic allies and China's diplomatic allies. Here's a look at how, when one country it's grown, while in the other it's dropped. It's not just during the DPP government's rule that Taiwan has lost friends. Countries cut diplomatic ties even when the current opposition party, Kuomintang, seen as more Beijing-friendly, was in power in the 1990s and early 2000s. 1996 was a significant milestone in Taiwan's democratic journey, staging the first direct presidential elections. Taiwan at the time had 30 diplomatic allies. During KMT leader Ma Ying-jeou's 8-year-long term as president, Taiwan lost 2 allies. However, since Tsai Ing-wen came into power in 2016, the numbers of allies have plunged to 12. Now, compare that to China. Since assuming power in 2013, Xi Jinping has adopted a more assertive stance on cross-strait relations compared to his predecessor Hu Jintao. Under Xi's leadership, there has been a noticeable increase in the number of countries switching their diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing. Taiwan has called this trend China's dollar diplomacy, where economic incentives are used to sway nations to align with Beijing. So, Yavor, what makes a country switch ties from Taiwan to China? Is it just about money?
The short answer is yes. However, many of the countries that are still supporting Taiwan, although they're shrinking, they do see value in long-term friendship and development programs that actually do benefit their people. I believe that when it comes to development, and many of the countries that support Taiwan now are countries that seek development assistance, actually they should look for a long-term project where Taiwan can help them to basically teach them how to catch the fish, not just provide the fish. And this is quite often what Beijing is not doing. Beijing provides support for some projects, but in general, they do not try to help, particularly in the development of those countries as much as Taiwan could. I believe that the long-term orientation also could be complemented with a focus on human rights development in some of the allies of Taiwan, because that differentiates Taiwan from China, where human rights are quite often not observed.
Now, you brought up similar values, but if you look at Taiwan's allies at the moment, their diplomatic allies, many of them don't have stellar human rights records or even the kind of free and fair democracy that Taiwan prides itself on.
It could provide facilitating mechanisms so that hopefully these countries will develop in that direction. It could easily ask some of its recipients of aid to just abide United Nations human rights declarations, and by doing so, it would just hint that that is the right approach. So if they then develop this way, they could even provide more assistance, because that will be in line with Taiwanese values. And also, similarly, it could hint at democratic values and forms of governance, but again, it should do it in a very careful way, because that could be considered as interference of domestic affairs of those countries, which might fire back at Taiwan. So
if we see this current trend of more allies shifting to China, and say Taiwan is left with very few or no diplomatic allies, can it survive?
Well, it is already clear by now that Taiwan has lost what is called 1.0 track diplomacy vis-a-vis Beijing, not only by losing Nauru, but the trend has been persistent in the past 2-3 decades. And having said that, Taiwan has other options, yes. Taiwan can engage in way more public diplomacy, where China has limitations. And by doing so, Taiwan could present itself to the world in a different image and a stronger image. And I think that utilizing digital technologies is one way forward. To my knowledge, since 2018, there are a couple of non-governmental agencies that work, but they're created by private citizens. There is the Taiwan Digital Diplomacy Association, just to name one. And then these actors are basically what we call non-state diplomatic actors. They have a political clout and connections to influence countries abroad. So they do exercise that. Sometimes they do work with the government, which is called twin-track diplomacy. And sometimes the government also engages in 1.5 or 2.0 track diplomacies. This is to say more on the cultural aspect, people-to-people aspect, and to boost the connections towards all different sectors of society. I think that Taiwan can shine there way more than and outpace Beijing, because of the constraints of the authoritarian party, which does not allow for private citizens to engage in this kind of political activities. So if Taiwan utilizes this, I believe that the visibility of the Taiwan and the cross-strait issue, as well as the advantages of Taiwan, and not only semiconductors, but also in the disinformation space, also in the healthcare and other spaces where Taiwan is at the forefront. I believe that will benefit Taiwan greatly, and this way it could actually not only survive but thrive.
Now, I want to talk about the ripple effect these defections have, and Nauru's switch to Beijing could be especially impactful in terms of regional security. Professor Yen Chen-shen explains why the move is a concern to Australia.
Strategically, Nauru is not as important, but the more important thing is it does represent that Australia, the country, the power in the region, cannot stop or cannot keep the Pacific Island country from moving to Beijing's side, just like the U.S. cannot stop the Latin American ally of Taiwan to switch diplomatic recognition.
All right, let's start with what he mentioned, the U.S. Why is this a concern for U.S. first?
Well, it is known since Obama's administration's rebalancing policy, at least since then, it is obvious that the United States wants to play a bigger role in the region. There is a lot of incentives for the United States to do so in terms of trade and other economic benefits, but also in terms of security. For the United States, there are the different island chains that should be maintained so that, in a way, to exercise control over the Pacific as well as the South China Sea, and the freedom of navigation as well is very important to the United States. So since the rebalancing policy and now the new the supplementing policy and the formation of the Quad, the ANZUS, and other security formations in the region, we observe that the United States has absolutely no intention to leave the region or to give China a free way to expand its influence in South China Sea or in the Pacific. That's why we observe much more escalation in the South China Sea with the Philippines or in the cross-strait relations as well, because the United States has made it clear that it has absolutely no intention to leave.
Right, so I want to stay with Taiwan's shrinking influence in the Pacific Islands. Now, Alex Bristow is the Deputy Director of the Australia Strategic Policy Institute, and he takes stock of the diplomatic situation in Oceania.
I think the first strategic implications are for Taiwan itself. It's obviously going to be further isolated from the international community with a diminishing number of countries to continue to recognize it. Now, countries like Australia, which recognize Beijing, they will say that they will do what they can to allow Taiwan to participate in international affairs. But it is still important, I think, that at least some countries recognize Taipei, and that's an increasingly smaller number. There are also implications for the character of the Pacific. There is now one fewer country in the Pacific Island Forum that recognizes Taiwan. That's been a number that's been going down over the last few years. So there's now only 3 countries left, Tuvalu and the Marshall Islands and Palau, both of those last two having very close relations with the US, that continue to recognize Taiwan.
Now, what's at stake if all the remaining Oceania countries switch allegiance to Beijing? And given that the US is a huge funder of many of these Pacific islands, does it have enough clout to keep them on side with Taiwan?
Well, I think that it is not as much as if other small countries will switch to Beijing or not. I think it is as to what happens then after the switch. If they do switch and allow Beijing to build military bases or to take over some of their existing infrastructures, then this would be a red line for the United States and its allies. Other than that, they have no reason to stop them to do the switch, since many countries have done so under the United Nations resolution. But at the same time, how they then treat Beijing is very important to the United States and its allies. So the only implications from a little country switching side is for the Taiwan's diplomatic space. As my colleague just said, it will shrink that space, and that will then provide a bigger influence of Beijing when they want other countries to not play with Taiwan.
Now, as mentioned, both the US and Australia have influence in the region, but as Alex Bristow explains, Canberra's hands are tied despite being the biggest donor to the Pacific Islands.
Fundamentally, the Australian government respects the sovereign decision of Nauru to conduct its diplomatic relations as it chooses. Australia itself has, of course, recognised Beijing since 1972, so it can't really dictate to others not to do so. Fundamentally, Australia will say that they'll continue their partnership with all the countries of the Pacific on the basis of respecting their sovereignty and making an offer that is in those countries' interests, which includes being the preferred security partner for the region.
Okay, so we've seen here that Taiwan has some pretty big backers, Australia, the US, and many other democratic parts of the world. So what can Taiwan do instead of, in terms of informal relationships to help make sure that Taiwan maintains its place on the world stage?
Yes, the West and the backers, so the so-called backers, actually they try to get benefits from both sides on the Strait, and we see that in the fact that they say that they would help Taiwan, but at the same time they engage Beijing over and over and try to gain economic and other benefits from mainland China as well. So this kind of policies of ambiguity or uncertainty obviously are mimicked then, and then this is not very conducive to the security and stability of the region. But obviously we should understand why that is the case. Even countries that have the highest interest in maintaining the peace in the region, like Japan, even they have heavily invested in China in terms of trade and also foreign direct investment. So let's take Japan, for example. If anything would to happen in South China Sea or in the Taiwan Strait or anywhere in near Japan, for them that will be probably the most impactful for their security as well. So I think that having said that, Japan would have the highest interest to support Taiwan or to support peace in general in the environment around its islands. And the interest is common, as well as obviously the threats might be in the future common. So because of that, I believe that they're natural allies.
Yavor, let's take a step back now from the geopolitics of this and look at the lives that are affected by the diplomatic back and forth. TaiwanPlus's Reese Ayers reports on the Nauru students in Taiwan who are facing an uncertain future.
Now, when a country severs diplomatic ties with Taiwan, some of the first people to feel the effects of that are students, particularly those studying on scholarships. Now, there are over 50 students from Nauru studying in Taiwan, and 30 of those have scholarships from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, whether or not those students will be able to continue studying is still yet to be decided. Ming Chuan University has a total of 15 students from Nauru, and this school is going to do everything they can to try and help them.
Right now that I think it takes time for them to really adjust their steps and think of what they want to do in the future. Most of them, actually all of them are the scholarship students. So they need to, consider how they can continue their schools in Taiwan. Sometimes there might be some scholarships, from somewhere else, or hopefully, or, their countries might provide some, next steps, for them.
Now, Taiwan has steadily been losing diplomatic allies over the past few years and decades. The last one to go was Honduras in 2023. Now, when that happened, Honduran students actually got together, they made groups, they got their parents involved, and they petitioned the Honduran government to try and get funding for them to finish their programs in Taiwan if they so wished. Some students actually chose to go over to China to finish their programs there. Now, once the shock for the Nauruan students currently studying in Taiwan has subsided, they will face similar decisions about whether or not they want to continue their studies here, if they can, or if they want to go over to China to continue programs there. Eason Chen and Reese Ayers for TaiwanPlus.
Yavor, I'm sure you recognize your colleague there at your university. Can you tell us more about the situation of the Nauruan students and what their options could be?
Yes, this is actually the vice president of our university, Ms. Lin. And yes, she was very right that normally universities would try to adjust and help the students, but in the end of the day, it is up to the governments, to their respective governments, to take care of them. Students shouldn't be treated as units and just as numbers. I believe that especially for countries like Nauru that switch sides between Beijing and Taipei, I think Beijing and Taipei should establish some kind of mechanism to at least recognize their credits, or at least have a framework to allow them to finish their studies, so that at least those that are in their last year or almost finished. I think this is very important. And let's just play it out. If this student is allowed to finish and then go back home, the student would always feel good because the experience so far in Taiwan has been great. And now if they go home and they're allowed to graduate, they go home, they will always be ambassador of Taiwan. But if they're basically kicked out of the country, and basically the 3.5 years that the Taiwanese government has spent money on this student is just wasted. This is taxpayers' money that are just simply wasted. And this should not be the case. There should be a way to maybe find a way to finish their studies, at least for those that are almost graduating.
Absolutely. A little bit of goodwill goes a long way. Thank you so much, Yavor A. Kostadinov, Assistant Professor at Ming Chuan University, speaking to us from Sandanski in Bulgaria. Thank you so much for your time. And for our viewers everywhere, it has been good to have your company. If you've enjoyed today's episode or have anything you'd like to add to the dialogue, do join the conversation on our social media. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.